I don't like talking about books in a negative light, and if you noticed, but we live in a bit of a shit world at the moment, and I don't need to pile on that by being really negative about books. All of my written reviews are positive. I usually don't ask for a review copy of a book unless I'm pretty sure I'm going to like it. I don't like talking about books in a negative light unless I have a really good reason for it. And that's kind of why I'm here talking about The Midnight Library. I really like Matt Haig. I like him as a person. As far as I know, I haven't met him, but I like what he stands for, his work for mental health, especially in men. I love his nonfiction. I've read Reasons to Stay Alive and Notes on a Nervous Planet. These are two of my favourite nonfiction books. They've helped me in dark times. They've helped me rewire the way that I see the world a little bit. I think Matt Haig is a force for good, but I don't love his fiction. His newest book, The Midnight Library, has been getting a lot of media attention. It's a wonderful thematic journey. I think it's a fantastic plot. It feels like the novelization of his personal philosophy, and I think that that's really important. But I still struggle with Matt Haig's fiction writing. So let's talk about why. So at the top of this video, I said that I don't talk about books in a negative light unless I have a really good reason to. And I have two reasons for talking about The Midnight Library. One is that it gives me a reason to talk about Matt Haig and his work in a positive way. I didn't love The Midnight Library, but I do love Matt Haig, and I do love his nonfiction. The other reason is that The Midnight Library is problematic in an interesting way. So, The Midnight Library is a very, very good story, and it has fantastic themes and a great central conceit. It is the story of a 35-year-old woman called Nora who lives in her hometown of Bedford, Bedfordshire, very close to where I am right now. Nora has not lived the life that she kind of hoped that she would. Through various situational problems, she has kind of fallen apart. And she's reached the end of her tether and it's about to snap. And so, very early in the book, she attempts to kill herself. She overdoses and she wakes up in the Midnight Library. The Midnight Library is a place between life and death where you can browse the shelves and explore an infinite number of alternate lives that you have lived. You know about the many worlds theory, the idea that every choice we make splits off and creates two alternate timelines, and there are infinite of these because there are infinite choices that we make every second of every day, little tiny choices that create alternate parallel lives. So Nora is in this library and it is kind of curated. She has a Yoda figure who guides her, who takes the form of a woman from her childhood who was very important to her, Mrs. Elm. She was the librarian at her school, and she guides Nora around the library. And she shows her all these different books and says, these are different lives that you could have lived. You can jump into them, spend a day or a few days in that life, and if you like that life, you can just go on living it forever, and you slowly assimilate into it and forget your old life, forget the library, and you become this other version of yourself. If you don't like it, you jump back to the library and you try another one. And so that's most of the book, is that Nora goes through all these different versions of herself that she could have lived. And you kind of know very early on that this book is going to end in a kind of Christmas Carol or It's a Wonderful Life kind of a way, or at least I assumed it would. So this central story, the character of Nora, the plot, the pacing, the development of it, and the themes that are explored about regret are great. It's very, very clear early on the idea that you can never be completely satisfied with life. You really just have to make the best of it. Every day is a new day where you get to make new decisions and you get to choose how you live your life, at least, to a degree. And I really like this. It's great. It has some really, really powerful themes. These are all great things about the book. And ultimately, if you like the sound of all of that, of the character of Nora, of the story, of the library, of the themes of the book, then this is one for you. It's a wonderful book. But, as I've said, I have some real issues with it. The Midnight Library is a wonderful book, but I refuse to believe that it had an editor. This book was clearly rushed out. I follow Matt Haig on Twitter very closely because his life advice is great, And I enjoy him as a celebrity, you know, someone to follow. I like to see what he gets up to. I remember very distinctly him talking about the idea of this book. Then I remember him having like a blank Word document open and here we go, here's the book. And then suddenly the book was done. I blinked and the book was finished. Then suddenly he was picking out the cover of the book, and I remember him asking on a Twitter poll which one was better. Then suddenly the book was released. And you can tell that this is a book that was pushed out as quickly as possible. I don't blame Matt Haig for this. He writes quickly, that's great, good for him. Maybe it's his publisher. They were very, very eager. They know that his name will sell. It'll become a Sunday Times best-selling novel very, very quickly. And it did. It did do that. So it feels like it was pushed out, and I really don't believe it was edited. The reason I don't think it was edited is because it is fucking full of typos, awkward grammar, and just really, really simple mistakes. There's one page where two characters are having a conversation. A and B are chatting to each other. A says something, B says something, A says something, and then A reacts to that in the next line. And suddenly you can't remember who is who, and it doesn't make any sense. And this was obviously just a mistake. Maybe a line got deleted and wasn't replaced with anything. Why did this happen? There was no editing. It wasn't edited at all. Right at the very end of the book, Nora calls another character by her own name. I'm not just nitpicking, this happens constantly throughout the book, and there are a handful of times where it's really noticeable, but there are constant typos and weird grammar mistakes and missing punctuation marks. It's not really excusable when it's such a massive novel by a massive novelist through a massive publisher like Canongate. This shouldn't happen, but it did. The Midnight Library is wonderful, but the first 30 pages of this book are horrendous exposition. They are marred by atrociously awkward exposition. It's really painful to read. And this is another reason why I don't think the book was edited, because it takes a while to get into the flow when you're writing something. And then once you find that flow, you get through it and you finish it. And you might find that when you go back, it's the beginning, the first act, the first third, whatever, that needs the most editing, that needs the most work, because you found the flow and the book got better as it went and you became more confident and comfortable and your characters come to life by themselves, etc., etc. And then you go back and you realize that it was a rocky beginning. But that rocky beginning is still there. It's horrible exposition. Nora is an unlikable character. Now, Nora's unlikable because she's depressed. I understand that. But it's really more about her behavior, which doesn't match the Nora that we see later on. And again, I know Nora changes and grows as she goes on. She has a story arc. She has a character arc. I get that. But you have to read it to see what I mean. She just doesn't feel like a character at all yet, let alone what she becomes later on. She doesn't feel like a fully fleshed out character. And this exposition is painful. In order to build her character, you have to introduce a set of supporting characters. You've got her brother, Joe. You've got her friend, Ravi, who was the original drummer in their band. You have a guy that she meets. He's a doctor, and he asked her out for coffee once, and she said no because she was in a relationship with this guy called Dan. So we meet Dan. The guy who asked her out for coffee was Ash. You get to meet all these people, and they're all interesting characters in their own way, but they are shoehorned into the beginning through horrible exposition, and it is painfully grating. I was almost blushing as I was reading the first 30, 40 pages of this book. It's so cringe. It's horrible. I'm gonna find a bit. Okay, so page 6, chapter 2, we've just started. Ash, the doctor that I mentioned, has knocked on Nora's door in the evening to give her some bad news. He was jogging past her house, and he knocks on the door for a reason. And they have this little conversation. The conversation goes like this. Are you running? A pointless question. He was clearly out for a run, but he seemed relieved momentarily to have something trivial to say. Yeah, I'm doing the Bedford half. It's this Sunday. Oh, right, great. I was thinking of doing a half marathon, and then I remembered I hate running. This had sounded funnier in her head than it did as actual words being vocalized out of her mouth. That's a long sentence, isn't it? This sounded funnier in her head than it did as actual words being vocalized out of her mouth. So this sounded funnier in her head than it did out loud. That's how you would say that sentence. This sounded funnier in her head than it did out loud. Than it did as actual words being vocalized out of her mouth. I've been reading this book for like 3 minutes and I didn't know whether to carry on because I was embarrassed by that line. I'm still embarrassed. And then it goes on. You told me you had a cat, he said eventually. Yes, I have a cat. You told me you have a cat. Yes, I have a cat. Not just, yeah. Yes, I have. I remember his name. Voltaire. Yeah, I call him Volts. He finds Voltaire a bit pretentious. It turns out he's not massively into 18th century French philosophy and literature. He's quite down to earth, you know, for a cat. So Matt Haig is trying to create a character who is jovial, who is clearly awkward and not very good at socializing because she's feeling depressed and anxious and nervous. I get all of that. We've all made bad jokes and we've all been nervous talking to someone maybe we have a crush on or maybe just another person. But it still doesn't quite feel real. Quite often through this book, Matt Haig is trying to create characters and moments where these people feel real and also sometimes feel cool, for lack of a better term. In several of these different worlds, lives, Nora lives, she's a poet. And it's difficult to know. Obviously, Matt Haig wrote all the poems that she writes and that you get to read through the book. And you can't tell whether it's supposed to be awkward bad poetry because she's an awkward bad poet or whether Matt Haig is an awkward bad poet. It's difficult to tell the difference. And sometimes I think that maybe the problem with this is that the better you get to know an author, the more they are in the limelight, the more difficult it is to separate them from their work. I don't know if anyone will agree with me on this, but if you get to know an author's face and voice and personality through interviews, through Twitter, through them being on YouTube or something, then suddenly it's very difficult to imagine their writing beyond them as a person. You can't really, you marry them too much. I remember reading one of the Song of Ice and Fire books that had a really raunchy, really explicit sex scene. And as I was reading this sex scene, I was picturing George R.R. Martin's face as he was writing it. I didn't like that. I didn't like doing that. So when an author is in the limelight, and actually they are usually men, suddenly anything that they write, I can see their face and I can't help but I can't separate them from their art. Point is, I am a little sad about this. And I felt the exact same way when I read How to Stop Time. I felt that Matt Haig's writing is rough around the edges. It is stodgy. It is a bit limp. It's lacking in any kind of poetic depth or rhythm. His metaphors are dry and not that interesting. But his central conceits, his ideas and his themes and his characters are always excellent. It's just not very literary. It's not very beautiful. It's just lacking. And you know, quite often his books do feel like YA that is not advertised as YA. It's simple. They're simple themes that are really, really useful lessons to learn. But I just always hope that they're going to be a little bit more. And I think that's because I get a lot more out of his nonfiction. Matt Haig's nonfiction is intensely interesting. He has real lessons to teach. I remember reading Notes on a Nervous Planet, and every single page, no matter how long the chapter was, I felt like I'd suddenly learned a lesson that I could apply to my real life. It felt like therapy. It felt like something constructive. And then when I read this, it is like you're taking one of those chapters and extrapolating it into a 300-page novel. And you kind of go, all right, I get the idea. And because his ideas are so sound, when that idea is placed into a novel with a central character who has to have an arc and has to have a story and has to have supporting characters and has to have dialogue, you get a little sad because suddenly the magic of Matt Haig's thoughts, ideas, dreams, feelings, lessons, philosophies all kind of fade away and are replaced by zero editing, bad spelling and grammar, shoddy characterization, awkward, cringe-inducing exposition, and just some kind of limp and lifeless character and dialogue writing. The dialogue in this book is upsettingly bad in places because it's wooden and it's dry. And I'm saying a lot of horrible things. And you know the worst thing about saying horrible things here is that I really like Matt Haig. He's supportive and sweet and kind and good. And I have read books by him. Again, his 2 nonfiction books have changed me and helped me, and I'm grateful for that. And I wouldn't make this video if I didn't have enough good shit to say about Matt Haig and what he writes. But I've tried his fiction twice, and there is no editing, and there is bad exposition, and it is clunky, slow, dry, lifeless writing, and awkward dialogue that I just struggle to believe. These are not people I believe. And so suddenly all of his great philosophies and his themes and his ideas start to fall away. It's a shame. As someone who reads a lot of fiction, I can't enjoy it. But I still love Matt Haig.